Everyone is welcome here, it's time to make new friends. Fill your Glenfarclas. Share a dram with the spirit of Edmonton. Sluncha!
Good day, whiskey brothers, whiskey sisters, and whiskey friends, and welcome to the Whisky Book Club's second book of season 3 with Pip Hills, the author of this book right here, The Founder's Tale, A Good Idea and a Glass of Malt. And as always, I'm honored to have you, the viewer, with us today as well. Now, there are other whiskey book clubs out there right now, but none that delve so deeply into the subject matter with the author and friends than right here. So, my name's Dolph. I'm the president of the Alberta Scotch Society and founder of the Whisky Book Club. I'm a proud member of the SMWS Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and I'm your host tonight. For those of you that are new to the Whisky Book Club, I'll explain a little bit what we're about. We are a home base, a safe place for whiskey geeks that love to share a dram and share a passion for reading, mostly about whiskey and whiskey-related activities. So this book, this one right here, right there, is the 13th book we've reviewed on the Whisky Book Club. It's also the first of 2 books that Pip has authored. The second being The Star Drive, the true story of a genius, an engine, and our future. And he's also a masterful storyteller. He's the founder of the SMWS, and he is here with us tonight. So welcome, Pip. I'm so glad that you could come. Tell us what's in your glass tonight before we even start.
I've no idea.
You've no idea. 35 point something.
It's because of this arcane labeling system, which I confess I invented for the Whisky Society. Because when we started the thing in 1983, everyone that we spoke to in the whiskey industry said, "Oh, you can't do that, or we'll take legal action against you and we'll close you down." And they were very big and very powerful and pretty rough bunch.
And scary. Yep.
And I took advice as to how they could take action against us. And the one thing which in which they were on good legal ground was if we put anyone's name or the name of a distillery on our bottle, then we would be liable for an action for passing off as something that we were not, because the names of all the distilleries were registered as trademark, and we would be infringing somebody's trademark. So we hit on this nifty idea of why don't we give each of the distilleries a number and each of the casks from each of those distilleries a number, consecutively numbered in the number of casks we bottled. And that would allow us to do what we wanted to do, which was to identify particular casks, which is the whole point of the Whisky Society. And right now I'm drinking whiskey, which is number 35.255, which means it's distillery number 35 on the Society's list. And it's the 255th cask from there that the Society has bottled.
And a good friend and a member of the panel is saying that.
And I couldn't tell you offhand which distillery it was.
But that's okay. We have friends in the background telling us that it's Glenfarclas and that, and he's going to be on the panel later on. Mr. Greg Perlinski, and I trust him completely. Excellent. So, and I should tell you what I'm drinking. So I'm 1-210, Keep in the Dark. So this is a Glenfarclas. I wanted to pick a number 1 cask because we're going to talk about your number 1 cask tonight as well. And this was graciously donated by Kelly and Rob Carpenter, the Canadian SMWS founders, and they're going to be on later as well. So thank you to them and everybody that I gave a sample to today that's going to be on the side. This is the sample that you got, this number 1-210. That's fantastic. So this will be a very different whiskey book club. We've covered 12 books, speaking with authors with whole bunches of different foci, a whole bunch of different styles. But you can tell right away in what I've said before, and Pip's preface, like, let's do this. I'm throwing a quote up here from you, Pip. It says, "Me, not being famous, perhaps I should tell you something of what this book is about. It has quite a lot to do with stories in pubs, places where people tell stories about their friends, acquaintances, and since no storyteller is worth his or her salt will diminish the dramatic content of a story, legends are born and propagated, and the mundane becomes, by a gradual process, the heroic." And that tells us about your propensity for the storytelling. You love the story. And Pip, this is a skill that you've developed on your own, influenced by fantastic characters from your past, and you bring them to life in the book very well. But I'm wondering if being a storyteller had some start within your family structure. Were your parents storytellers, and you became a storyteller as well?
No, I couldn't honestly say that was anything to do with that.
No?
I think it has a great deal more to do with Scottish pubs.
Excellent.
Now, the pub is a curious institution. It's not what in North America would be called a bar, although it has everything in common with a bar. But there are a lot of them. What are you doing?
Nothing.
Maggie's fiddling about in a drawer.
Sorry, my apologies. Fine.
That's quite okay, Maggie. You
You're
can do
right,
anything
yeah.
you
I know.
want.
Why don't you clear off? Yes, I mean, sorry. It's just that having somebody signaling to me that I should say this or I shouldn't say that is discommoding.
Canada. Canada.
So we were talking about the difference between
We're
our bar
talking about pubs.
and your pub. How are they very different? Is it just the
Traditionally,
storytelling element?
people would meet their friends and they would talk about their mutual friends and they'd talk about people of their acquaintance. And there is a tradition in Scotland, in Scottish pubs especially, for people to tell stories about their friends. I think if you want to find an origin for it, just a minute, Maggie's fiddling about in the drawer again.
Please carry on talking. Please.
I'll carry on talking
Yes.
when you stop fiddling about in the drawer.
Okay.
She's now writing me a note. I don't know what it's about, but she's taking her time about it. I don't, the note is frankly incomprehensible.
What you tell her?
I don't know enough about Canada to know if people have pubs in Canada. I imagine there's something similar. I reckon the tradition of storytelling in Scotland probably goes back a very long way. If I had to locate it anywhere, I would locate it in Celtic society, which was a heroic sort of society where people told stories about important people, about their friends. And I can remember lots and lots of conversations in pubs.
And
Sorry,
this started university times, I'm guessing,
It's
Pip?
very irritating.
So, Pip, I'm guessing university times is when you started this.
There are, I reckon that the tradition of storytelling in Scottish pubs probably has its origins in Celtic society, where people would meet round a fire, drinking a glass of whiskey, and they would tell stories about heroic members of their clan or their family group, what have you. And I can think of lots and lots of, I mentioned various pubs in the book, pubs where people tell stories about their friends. And I was just part of that. It seemed to me that given the nature of the whiskey industry, and when I started the society in the early 80s, given the nature of whiskey, there was a conspiracy to stop people telling stories about whiskey, other than certain officially sanctioned ones.
Okay.
The reason for this was very simple, was that whiskey was dominated by blended whiskey, and malt whiskey was something of which, by and large, the whiskey industry didn't approve. They regarded malt whiskies almost entirely as being fillers for blends,
Right.
which was where they made their big bucks, their large profit margins.
Mm-hmm.
So it was actually quite difficult to find out very much about malt whiskey. I had the good fortune to be a friend of David Dykes. David was a scholar and a professor, and his book about Scotland and whiskey, which was published in 1968, is still one of the best books about whiskey. And David tells stories, and he tells stories in that book about people in the whiskey industry who didn't actually understand the value of malt whiskies, who seriously regarded malt whiskey as simply being things for giving flavor to blends. And this is something quite extraordinary, and it shows you what a very long distance the whiskey industry has traveled, or what great distance people who want to know about whiskey have traveled. And so as a result, there weren't an awful lot of good stories being told about whiskey, because it was in the interest of the owners of the big blends to suppress the small stories about whiskey.
Okay.
And part of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, of course, was that we weren't constrained by any of these considerations,
Right.
and we could tell stories as we liked. And luckily, I had lots of friends who were the sort of people that I would tell stories about. And of course, some of the stories ended up being about me, which was fine by me. But one of the problems about stories is that they do change. People hear a story and then retell it, and stories alter and develop. And a great many stories had grown up about the Scotch Malt Whisky Society and how it came about and what was happening. And in some cases, the stories had ceased to bear any relation to the truth. And so I thought it was about time, just a few years ago, about time that I set the thing down as I saw it.
Well, I like it when stories are embellished. I've got to say, I do like the more embellishment, the better, especially when we are in a pub and drinking a dram, Pip. And I want to hear stories like that as they're embellished. But the book is important. But I do need to ask you about this. Is it more of an homage to a great idea, or is it more to friendship, or both in equal measures?
I think certainly for both. I mean, it's a paean to friendship and the pleasure of discovering malt whiskey that way, and of leading other people to a similar revelation. I mean, what better recipe for friendship and for stories could you find? And the thing is, I gradually came to realize that the starting of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society did itself constitute one of the great stories, possibly one of the best stories about whiskey. Here was a drink which had been disregarded for a long time, which was used in a way which obscured its excellence, and which nobody was talking about. And if you look at any of the early books, the books before David Dykes' Whiskey and Scotland, you will find there aren't many of them, and you will find that on the whole they are anodyne sort of volumes parrot the official whiskey industry line and which tell you very little that you want to know about. Probably the best book about whiskey before David Dykes was Neil Gunn. Neil Gunn was a Scottish author who wrote lots of novels. He was also an exciseman who spent most of his life in distilleries, so he knew the whiskey industry from the inside. And he wrote a book which was published, I think, about 1936, in the depths of the pre-malt whiskey era, when all whiskies were blended whiskies. And it's simply entitled Scotch Whisky. And I couldn't recommend it more highly because it describes in no uncertain terms how someone who really knew this stuff felt about what the whiskey industry had done to Scotland. And basically, Neil Gunn comes out quite clearly, says the whiskey industry is guilty of depriving the Scottish people of their national drink in its finest form. Now, that's strong stuff.
It is, and I like that. So you've mentioned 2 books that I need to get now, 2 more.
Well, absolutely. Those 2, if you want to understand the origins of the modern perception of malt whiskey, you have to have those 2.
Perfect. Before we get too much further into the book or the story of the SMWS, I just want to get a little bit of background information on you pre-syndicate so I can kind of put everything into perspective. So if you could tell us a few things. Were you married at the time, university? What was your job? Were you a young idealist or possibly a young entrepreneur, because you were an accountant as well? So I don't know where you were in those leanings. And maybe tell us about Edinburg in the 70s. When this happened, like you were saying, it was all Scotch blends, and you would get Scotch with lemonade served to you most often in the bar, as opposed to going straight. Of course, single malts were in the minority, and inspecting, understanding, and discussing Scotch was not the norm. Not whatsoever. You drank.
Nothing could be truer. For a start, most pubs didn't sell malt whiskey. There were a handful of pubs in Edinburgh where you could buy a malt whiskey. If you went into a pub and simply asked for a whiskey, you would be poured a blended whiskey.
Right.
There were a few, by the time I started the society, there were quite a few malts appearing in bottle. That had started way back in the early 1970s. Glenfiddich probably started it. They were the first on the scene with their very recognizable triangular green bottle. And
they were the first in the United States and Canada. I didn't know if they were the first for you. So that's a good question.
I think they were the first people to bottle malt whiskey on any scale. And Macallan started quite early. Glenfarclas were bottling malts from fairly early, but all of a very limited circulation because there was no demand. Amazingly, because the whiskey drinking public, well, in Scotland particularly, people who drank whiskey drank it with lemonade. I mean, when you went into a pub, or you drank it as a shot and knocked it back quickly, one or the other. And
so not appreciating the whiskey whatsoever.
There's
a means to have fun.
And a whole lot of things came together when we started the society. And first of all, bottling individual casks. And we were fortunate in getting some really fine casks to begin with. And then the idea of inspecting the whiskey as though it were a wine, and looking at it and trying to describe its flavors. Because, of course, the description of flavor and the appreciation of flavor are things that go together. You don't know what you're smelling or tasting unless you have a vocabulary which can at least approximate to it. And
that was not happening at the time. But tell us about yourself, though. Let's not skip over the personal stuff. Were you in university, just out of university? What is that?
I've had, I suppose you would call it a very checkered career. You wouldn't call it a career at all. When I left school at the age of 17, I went straight to university to study medicine. Okay. I spent 2 years officially in the study of medicine, but in fact spent most of my time climbing mountains. At the end of my second year, a week before I should have been sitting my exams, I was away climbing a mountain, and I managed to fall off it. And I fell rather a long way. I fell about 50 meters, which is a long way to fall. And I was fortunate in that I landed on a ledge on which was growing a juniper bush. And the juniper bush broke my fall sufficiently to enable me to spend a few months in hospital, but at least to survive. I worked at various jobs. I spent a couple of years recuperating and worked at various jobs in the meantime. Then went back to university, not to study medicine, but to study for an arts degree, and discovered philosophy. Okay. And I was hooked. I remember the traditional formal logic I thought was wonderful. This was a subject whose teaching hadn't really changed in 500 years. And I thought it was just great. And it taught people how to argue and what was a valid and an invalid argument. And I was very excited by it. So I then spent the next 7 years studying philosophy and supporting myself from time to time with various industrial jobs, right, which I liked fine because I was brought up in that sort of background, and I always found it very easy to get on with people who didn't have my educational background. And I was lucky. It was the 1960s when employment was not a problem for anyone with a couple of degrees. You could always get a job, and I became a civil servant and worked for the Inland Revenue for 4.5 years. This was my way of going straight, of doing a straight job and showing that I could. And in those days, there was a kind of officer class of the civil service, which you could get into if you had the right academic qualifications. And I could and did. And I stayed there for 4.5 years, and until eventually I couldn't avoid the conclusion that whatever it was I was going to do with my life, it wasn't going to be this, going to work in a pinstripe suit and sitting behind a desk. So I resigned. And I then did various things. I found myself in demand as a tax accountant and a tax lawyer because the revenue had trained me in such matters. And that enabled me to keep body and soul together. I got married. I had 2 children. And by the early 80s, I was running an accountancy firm, not a highfalutin tax avoidance firm, I should say, but more like a Robin Hood sort of operation, whereby I made sure that people who didn't have a whole lot of money didn't have to pay very much in tax. And this was actually a problem at the time for self-employed people, because the tax scheme in this country was heavily skewed, whereby people who were in regular employment didn't pay terribly much tax, and people who were making pots of money didn't pay much, but poor devils who were self-employed had problems. So I gained a very large acquaintance. I also had an awful lot of friends. I tried to take over our local television station at one point, and that was a whole lot of fun. And
did it work?
No, it didn't. I'm pleased to say. I was the slightest interest in television then or now. I thought it was frankly, watching television a waste of time, and with a few exceptions. But I was running my tax accountancy firm. I had by that time 2 or 3 partners, and we ran it from rather a posh office in the middle of Edinburgh. Okay. And I was fortunate in that I had a certain amount of freedom of action.
Okay.
And I used that freedom of action to do things that seemed like a good idea at the time. And it was round about then that I discovered this amazingly fine whiskey, which you're drinking.
Yes,
and I had been involved in the early days of submarine archaeology back in the late 60s and early 70s, and together with two of my friends who were the Mercados, whom I write about in the book, I got involved in scuba diving, and through a friend of ours who was the professor of archaeology in the university, did some research on Neolithic lake dwellings called crannogs in Scotland. And that was fun. And I was fortunate in being able to do a whole lot of different things. And I just, through Duncan and through his farm in Aberdeenshire, I met Stan, whom I write about in the book. And this guy was a wealthy old farmer who once a year got in his Land Rover and went over the hill to Speyside, and from George Grant at Glenfarclas would buy a quarter cask of whiskey. And Stan would come with a lemonade bottle full of dark liquid when he knew I was there, and we would drink his whiskey. And I thought it was incomparably the finest whiskey I'd ever tasted.
And that was the Glenfarclas, the number 1, the very first cask.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you a bit more about this story, but I just want to get this straight first. So you were, let's say, an entrepreneur because you went into business for yourself. You have a healthy distrust of the aristocracy a little bit because you're helping the little guy with the Robin Hood. And your philosophy leanings helps you with your idealistic kind of stance in the world. So we're kind of a mix of everything, I think, there, Pip. I think you're bringing something for everything. So all your different jobs make sense. And I think it probably did help you in the creation of something like Scotch Whisky Society, because I think you'd probably have to have a good group of friends, which you explain in the book, that helps you along the way, people that are going to support you emotionally, financially, and you've got that background. So I think we're well set up for the story. We can get a good idea of what you are, which is a little bit of everything, which is good. And we're now at the farm, and your friends just bought the farm where they could raise a certain type of pony, I think, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. And from there, we're going to number 1, Glenfarclas. So if we could get that story, please. I just wanted to put this in context for people as we're listening to this story.
You want me to take it on from there?
I do want you to take it on from there, if you would, please.
Just a second. We'll wait till Maggie does whatever she's doing.
And my wife does think that the philosophy explains the names on the bottlings. And just a quick note, were you involved in the extravagant names from the very beginning, or was that something that started later on?
You were talking about the tasting notes and things like that.
Well, no, I'm talking specifically about the titles of the bottles. Kept in the Dark is what this one is. And there's things like that.
That's something that came about long after I left.
Okay.
While I was there, I set my face against that and said there should be nothing but the label and the numerals on the bottle.
Okay.
I reckoned if people were interested enough, we weren't trying to make the thing easily available. There's nothing wrong with having to, if you're interested in something, then having to do some work to get access to it.
I agree. Yes, it makes it that much more special when you finally get it or get it.
Exactly.
And you had to work a little bit to get your first cask. It wasn't so easy as just being offered to you. It was a little bit of work.
Yeah. But I hang on.
We'll hang on. I'll just have another drink. The more pauses you give me, I'll drink more and more. And by the end of the hour and a half or 2 hours, this might be quite
the story was fairly straightforward.
Okay.
I told my friends about the whiskey, and I said it was absolutely wonderful. Mm-hmm. And they were all people who liked whiskey. And I had this idea. I said, if you were interested, how do you fancy coming together as a syndicate and buying a quarter cask of whiskey? I don't know if they'd sell us one of these, but there's no harm in asking. And the friend said, yes, that's fine. You organize it, we'll do it, see to it. And so I got back in touch with Stan, and Stan gave me George Grant's telephone number, and I phoned him up and explained the situation. And he said, well, we don't normally sell to members of the public. We have a few casks where we lay down whiskey for old customers. And generally speaking, people take a cask a year.
Right.
But he said, as a matter of fact, one of our old customers has died recently and left no one to inherit his supply of casks. So since you're a friend of Stan's, you are obviously an okay sort of person, even though you're a lowlander. And if you wanted to, we could let you have a cask. So I went back to my pals and said, right, guys, here it is. He told, George Grant told me it would cost about £2,500, duty and excise duty and value-added tax paid.
Okay.
And that worked out about just over £100 a piece for about a gallon of whiskey.
Well worth it.
The friends all signed up, and I went up to Glenfarclas and collected a cask of whiskey. Yep. And I put it in the back of my old Lagonda.
Oh, and I'm going to pause you there. Which one does it look like? Would you say like that, or
that's what it looks like?
That there.
Better. The color was better. It was silver with a black flash down the side of it.
Okay, great.
And its trunk lid folds flat.
Okay, yes.
So you could actually put a cask, stand it on the trunk, and lash it down, needless to say.
Did you think it was going to leak everywhere in the back, or what? At that point,
as long as you don't bump it,
and the bung up top. So the bung hole up top, you have to seal it there and make sure it didn't. Okay.
Yes.
I'm just picturing it, and I think it would have been a bumpy ride in that car. I think.
Anyway, I went up to Glenfarclas, bought the cask, brought it back down, and we met in the lobby of my house in Scotland Street in Edinburgh. It's an apartment up a short flight of stairs with a big lobby. And the syndicate met in the lobby, and we hauled the cask up, and we turned it, we put it on a stand, and we knocked the bung out. And then I had bought glass gallon jars.
Okay.
sufficient to contain the entire contents. And we
drained the whole thing that night
into a jug, and we handed round drams. And I said, "Is it good enough?" And they all said, "Well, yes, it's pretty good." And then somebody said, "Perhaps we should have a second one just to make sure." So we all had another dram, and it was declared to be absolutely splendid whiskey. And so I simply siphoned all the whiskey out of the cask and into the jars.
Yes.
And what was left, we put into a jug, and then we drank what was left. And then everyone went off into the night clutching a gallon jar. And fortunately, nobody stumbled.
Good.
It would have been disastrous if somebody had. I had had a smart idea, which was I had phoned a taxi firm.
For everybody.
And they sent taxis for everyone, so everyone had a taxi home.
That was a very good idea. And a fantastic night. When you think about moments that would have been very fun in life, I think I can imagine being at a house and a cask coming in it's all its majesty, placed up, and the anticipation. You've never had single malt before, possibly, or never to this type, never a single barrel anyways. And then you taste that for the very first time in that atmosphere. I think that would have been a very memorable night. I think it might be like game-changing for a person. Yeah.
And everyone was happy, and they all went home. And over the next few weeks, they all gave drams to their friends. And the friends would usually say, "What wonderful whiskey, can I join?" So the members of the syndicate would give them my telephone number.
Yes.
And they would phone me up. Some of them were people I knew already. Some of them were strangers. And the strangers would say, "Well, you don't know me, but I'm a friend of so-and-so who's a member of your whiskey syndicate. If you get another cask, can I join in?" And I said, "Well, I've never had any intention of doing it more than once, but give me your phone number, and should we by any chance do it again, I'll at least give you a ring."
Okay.
And after another week or two passed by, and then one of the syndicate members rang me up and said, "Pip, I'm getting short of whiskey. Can we have some more?" And I said, "But that means you've got through a gallon of whiskey in less than a month." And I said, "Anyway, I had no intention of getting any more. I don't know if any more can be got." And they said, "Well, if you're thinking of doing it again, we'd like." So I said, "Okay." And eventually I had such a list of people who wanted to become syndicate members. And I had such a lot of syndicate members who had drunk most of their whiskey that I called a meeting of the syndicate. And I explained that all their pals wanted to join and that this would mean enlarging the syndicate. And they all said, very generously, they all said, "Oh, yes, let's double it in size."
Okay.
And we said, "Hold on. I don't know if we can double it in size. I don't know if we can get any more whiskey, but I can go to Glenfarclas and ask." And so I phoned up Glenfarclas and I explained the situation. And they said, "Well,
no,
we can sell you. You've had last year's cask in this line. We can sell you this year's and next year's, which would let you have 2 sherry quarters.
Okay.
But after that, we're not going to sell you any more until it has aged sufficiently, because this stuff is at perfection at round about 10 years old."
Okay.
So I said, okay, let's have these 2 casks. So it was arranged that I would go up to Glenfarclas again in the Lagonda And by this time, it was in February, and it was very cold. And the Lagonda didn't keep the rain out too well.
Ooh.
Its roof tended to leak.
Okay.
And it was very drafty, and its heater didn't work very well.
Oh, geez.
Glenfarclas, you had to go up over the Grampian Mountains.
You're going to catch cold in that car.
Yes, it was very chilly. But I went up to Glenfarclas with £5,000, but there was a problem that I couldn't get 2 casks on the trunk of the Lagonda. Fortunately, it wasn't like most posh old cars. It had been treated as a workhorse most of its life.
Oh, okay.
And it had a tow bar. So I borrowed a trailer and I brought the 2 casks down on the trailer.
Okay.
And everything was fine. I paid for it. They loaded it on the trailer and off I drove. But it was February and it was very cold and it was snowing as I came over the pass through the mountains.
Right.
And it was round about that point, Dramochta Pass, I remember it was called. I stopped because I stopped in a lay-by. There was nothing else on the road, completely deserted. And I needed to have a piss. So I stopped and did what was necessary. And I noticed that one of the trailer lights wasn't working. And I thought there's nothing much I can do about it. So I drove on home. Mm-hmm. And I got as far as Edinburgh before I heard a police car behind me. And the police car pulled me in. And the policeman came to by this time it was 4:00 in the morning. And the policeman said, who was I and what was I doing? And I said, well, as you can see, I gave him my driving license. I said,
yep,
I'm heading for home, which is half a mile away. And he said, what have you got in the trailer?
Quite a lot of whiskey.
I said, casks. And they said, what's in the cask? And I said, £5,000 worth of whiskey. Oh, he said, he had obviously never met anyone at 4:00 in the morning towing £5,000 worth of whiskey in an ancient car. So I said, I can explain. I explained about the syndicate, and I said, it's perfectly legal. It's paid for. It's
tax and all.
Duty. I've paid the value-added tax. And as far as I know, there is no law against my transporting my own whiskey in the middle of the night. And the policemen looked at each other and they said, no, I don't suppose there is. Where are you going? And I said, Scotland Street. They said, we'll escort you home to make sure there are no problems. And they escorted me home. And
I think they expected to get a dram for their troubles in the end.
Well, they did inquire as to when I was likely to be opening the casks, but I assured them it was not going to be that evening and that they were going to be safely stored in the garage behind my house.
My wife was saying she was hoping you didn't have a house full of people waiting for you at that point, like you did with the first one, because that would have been a long wait for them. And at 4:00 in the morning, getting 2 casks of whiskey, I think it would have been quite the day after that, Pip. It would have been fun.
Yeah.
I need to ask you though, Pip, when other people were asking to join the syndicate, were you thinking that you were going to make money at this point, or was this just an adventure for friends?
No, not at all.
Just friends. It's
friends, and it was done purely on a cooperative basis. Nice. And in fact, when I eventually, which was not that long after, started the Scotch Malt Whisky Society, and I put it to the members of the syndicate that there was a possible business here, I at least thought of the thing in terms of a public service. I didn't think of it as being a serious profit-making enterprise. I had my intention originally was that we would set up the firm, and we would work out what it cost us to get the whiskey, and we would sell it to whoever wanted it for sufficient to enable us to break even. I'm not sure that my investors thought in those terms.
Okay.
I think there were
But you
quite
did.
a few of the syndicate members who saw a money spinner in this, but that's certainly not how I saw it. I still saw it. So you were asking me in one of your questions as to whether this was idealism, and I suppose it was absurdly idealistic on my part.
I like to go to large thoughts, and the idealism as opposed to the entrepreneurial side. I like to know where you were fitting, and I think over time, I don't know if it changes, but I'll ask you that as the book progresses. But what I do notice in the book, this book right here, that just about all of your stories revolve around 3 or 4 different themes. One, you're willing to take a risk or make a mistake. And going there the first time, I think is one. When you were at the farm and you're fixing the tractor and your friend goes out and starts making waves in the field, trying to work the barley, and all the people coming around to watch you. I think that you're okay being the center of attention as well. I think you're okay with that. You're okay talking in a large forum to people.
Yes, I don't have a problem with it. I couldn't say it gratifies me particularly.
Okay.
But I don't mind it. I don't care whether I'm speaking to 2 people or 200. That's all much the same.
Okay. And well, I'm the same way. And in a small group, I like to be a center of attention. I've got to say it, Pip. I really do. And when I'm in a larger group, I like to do it as well. But I'm a teacher, and I think that's part of me being a teacher. Or I just have a large ego. One of the two, I'm not quite sure. But the third thing I do notice is you're quite lucky as well. You seem to be in the right place at the right time to be offered this cask, the second cask, to meet police officers that are very nice to you, that aren't going to pull you over for having a broken light. And I think I'm going to ask you throughout the book. We're going to be together for 3 weeks. I think I'm going to continue to ask you if you think it was really you willing to make or take a risk, you being okay with the situation and indulge, or if it was lucky, or if you're entrepreneurial, or if it's idealist. I think I'm going to go back from these themes. Because where I am now, I'm only chapter 11 into your book because I don't read very far ahead. I don't want to bring the future chapters into this week. I'm really interested to see how this changes over time. So let's go on. We've got roughly 10 minutes before we have other people in here, but I want to go back to the bar because I was thinking on the entrepreneurial side, if I wanted to create a tour of Edinburgh, I would want to include the vaults. I would want to go there, but I would also want to go to the places that contributed to the opening of the vaults. And you mentioned these places here. So you mentioned Horseshoe Bar, the Sandy Bells Bar, the Waterfront Wine Bar with your friends, the Babbity Boaster. And I'm wondering if these places, I have pictures. I'm wondering if these places still exist today. And if I could actually have people visit them as a tour prior going to this place right here. I'm wondering, are they still?
Yeah, I'm sure you could. They're all in existence today. There's no question about that. I'm sure if you were to find their phone number and ring them up, they'd be happy for you to bring a group of people. Excellent. That's not a problem.
Well, that would be something I'd love to do with some friends. We would go to Edinburgh. My wife and I invite friends and maybe a larger group. And then we would go and we would go through the process that brought us to the SMWS and finally to the vaults. So speaking about bringing people in, Pip, we're going to bring in the rest of our panel right now, if that's okay. So we've got Mr. Gregory Perlinski, which right there. He's a fellow SMWS member. And Gregory, what do you have in your glass? Do you have the number 1-210 as well?
I have the same one you have, Dolph. Younger bourbon finished Glenfarclas, which Glenfarclas won't sell bourbon finished, so it's nice to be able to try something that you can't find on the market.
And it's a 7-year-old, and I love the young whiskeys with the punch of flavor right up front. I really do. And that's
I'm with you there.
And our next two, Kelly and Rob Carpenter, and they are the Canadian SMWS Founders. Is there a better title for you, Rob and Kelly?
Nope, that's what we did. We founded SMWS Canada.
Very good.
And you do own a distillery in Edinburg, Holyrood Distillery, and we'll talk about that later as well, because that's terribly exciting. So I wanted to bring the whole group together because we're almost at the hour mark. We've been at this for 50 minutes, and I've got 3 out of my 10 pages of questions for Pip. So I know I'm not going to get through them all. I know this. But I wanted to bring you in case you three, because you've been down below, you've been watching this the whole time. Did you have questions about anything that we've already discussed? And I'll just open it up. Go ahead and talk anytime you want, and I'll drink this.
Well, I have 2 things. I thought it would be fun. Dolph, you asked Pip about whether he was responsible for coming up with the bottle names in the very early days. And Pip, you said, no, that came later. So I had a quick rummage in our cupboard, and I found what Pip, I think, might be a fair representation of an early style bottle where it's just the...
That's an original bottle, yes.
Nice.
I'm trying to get it centered. The distillation date, the bottling date, the proof, and the distillery code. There's no bottle name. There's no abbreviated tasting note. It's just bare bones.
Flavor profile.
No flavor profile. It's just bare bones with a wonderful picture of the vaults building depicted on the labels. Pip, is that pretty?
Yes, that's exactly as it was originally.
Yeah.
And is that what they look like when you came on board, Kelly and Rob?
Oh no, they'd advanced the design a number of times over the course of the years. So no, these predate us by a long shot.
Yeah.
And I think that was a 91.1. So the first barrel from, and Gregory, I'm going to go to you. 91.
I haven't seen a 91 at Edmonton. I think it's Dufftown.
It's Dufftown, yeah.
Okay.
Good memory, buddy.
Yeah.
I go to Gregory often in tastings, and he's a fountain of knowledge. So he's a fantastic person on the panel. He makes us all look terribly brilliant. Pip, so did you help design those labels? So the old ones that you saw.
Pretty much. I had a very clear idea in my mind as to what it should look like. It should be a traditional bottle, which, apart from anything else, had the virtue of being cheap. The cheapest bottle you can buy is a standard green glass bottle. And I also, the vaults had to appear on it. It was such a characteristic building.
Okay.
And I think it was a client of mine who was a designer who designed the label. I think. I'm not certain of that. But I was very clear that it had to have an air of antiquity about it.
Okay.
It shouldn't be fancy or modern, that it should speak of something old and traditional. And I think that label does.
And it's iconic.
There's a modern bottle label. Now,
Yeah, so that's the very latest, and this was the renditions prior to that.
yeah.
And I don't know, Kelly and Rob, you'd be able to
I
tell us.
don't like this at all.
That's the same rendition, actually. Those two are the same.
Yeah.
Are they?
The stripe.
The same type?
Yep.
I've got new ones behind me.
This is it's an old one. It's 25 years old.
Sort of a one in between them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, there are obviously several different versions. What I do like about this is, although the taper on the bottle looks bad, it means that you don't drop it so easy.
Okay.
I mean, a parallel-sided bottle can be bad news after you've had a few cans.
You just
So
need
it progressed.
Maggie.
The label, sorry, Dolph. So there was that original one that I showed,
Yep.
and then the next, I assume the next variation of that is
Yes.
a slightly smaller depiction of the building with a bigger circle around it, and now we've got a bottle name underneath.
Yes.
Code.
That's a later one.
Yeah.
Kelly, what's the name? I'm wondering if it was creative like they are now.
A Miller. So this is cask number 25.10. 25 is Glenmorangie, and it's called a Miller's Dram.
A Miller's Dram. Okay,
Miller's
so they're
Dram.
starting to be creative with the names, right?
Yeah.
I like that. Pip, I don't know if you like the direction they've gone with the creative naming of the bottles or not, or if you care one way or another. I tend to like it because it gives you a hint of what's in the bottom. And it's playful, and so I like it. So, what do you think, Pip? Are you okay with the new names? Do you like the playfulness, or do you want it to be?
By and large, I'm okay with what they've done in recent years. I think there was a point at which I disapproved of quite a lot of the things that were being done, but in recent times they have brought it very much back into something approximating to the original design ethos, and I think they're doing a good job. And anyway, these people have got a company to run. They can't afford to be idealistic like me and just try to break even. They've got shareholders to satisfy. And if I had been less idealistic, I might still have been in that seat. You have to be realistic about it. I think they're doing a very good job, and they're appealing to a great number of people. And I think you have to judge them, one, by the quality of the whiskey, which is at least as good as ever it has been, and in many cases it's better. And secondly, as to whether people like what they're doing. And I think judged by those criteria, they're doing a first-class job. And they don't pay me anything, so I don't have a vested interest.
Pip,
I don't
need get special bottles given
on his behalf. And on the subject of lies, damned lies, one of the great advantages of the Scotch Malt Whisky Society right from the beginning was that we could always say, what you see is what you get. And we are telling you the exact truth about this product as nearly as we can. And so the tasting notes had to be as nearly exactly correct as we could get it. Okay, and allowing for a certain amount of artistic license, but we did our best to stick to that. And I think the present management are doing a very good job of doing that. And again, the proof is in the fact that people like it and people respond to it.
And they keep flocking to the SMWS and it gets bigger. Gregory, you had a question, I think, kind sir.
Not so much a question as a comment about essentially with these independent bottlings and the needing for more labels and more flavor notes is it's a little different now with bottles exceptionally more expensive and exceptionally more global going around the world. Now a cask that has 288 bottles doesn't go that far. That can sell out in 3 nights somewhere. People can't go online or in a book and look, oh, this is my unicorn cask. When to find that, odds are that's kind of gone. And you can't say, well, I like this 93, I'm going to like the next 93, because all the 93s are completely different. That's the point. So when you are having people who are not going to get to sample every single cask that comes out, as just as the way with the large world now, I think we need some degree of tasting notes, or even going back to the earlier bottle, the color strip with the flavor profile is a good idea. I quite like that. I rely on it a fair bit.
I think the problem about the distribution of bottles was always going to be there. You get a few hundred bottles out of your cask, and it's just an impossibility once the society grows to a certain size that somebody in Canada should be able to suck the same whiskey as somebody in Japan.
No, not going to happen.
That was never going to be a problem. I must say I didn't like the idea of putting tasting notes on the bottle.
Okay.
Now, the tasting notes appear in the newsletter, in the bottling list. And I think that's the place for them. Yes, the outturn, they give you the tasting notes in full there. And I think that's the way to go. But again, you know, it's a bigger company now, and there are people building their careers on things like that.
Yes.
And you have to understand that people are trying to put their mark on things, and also there are a lot of people who regard this as something of historic significance. So if they can be associated with it in this way, then it's understandable that people should want to do it. And also, the world has moved on. It's been 40 odd years since we started it, and people have the public has a very different view of things, and I suppose respond more to a fancy label like that than they do to a very simple one, such as you were showing us from the beginning. I don't know. It's, you know, the guys in marketing have to make these judgments.
When I see a label from the 1970s and 80s, I get pretty excited when I see them. So, talking about this, the historical element, Robin Kelly, I'm going to include you on this question. And I did this before. I was showing the different pubs that they had that Pip mentions within the book. And I'm wondering if there's something else that you would add to that tour. Let's say you make a tour, and you're both business people. You're in Edinburg right now, and maybe you start a tour. The SMWS Whisky Week tour. Who knows? Where would you add, or what would you add to that? That would be part of the history.
There's one pub that I would certainly add to it, and that's the Portolaith.
Okay.
It's about a couple of 100 yards away from the vaults.
Ooh, okay.
And
will that show up in the book a little bit later on?
I believe it does.
Okay.
I think I tell a story about a certain American wine fancier or whiskey fancier whom I took to a Portolaith one night.
You know what? I did just read that, and I think it's chapter 10, and you were helping the owner out. She came back to you to ask for help with something, but that's for next week. We'll get to that next week. So we've got that pub.
Yeah, if you decide to go to memorable places, the Portolaith has certainly got to be one of them.
Okay. Robin Kelly, other than Holyrood Park Distillery?
It's a nice enough place, but it's new.
You're muted, Kelly and Rob.
Oh, you're muted, guys.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I would add the Bow Bar on Victoria Street. That's traditional old whiskey pub that is a pilgrimage for a lot of fans. And then it's the modern day of the society. So I would include the Queen Street venue. And if you're talking Scotland overall, and there's a brand new venue in Glasgow, which opened for a week and then got shut down by COVID. So it's still getting its feet underneath it. But certainly, and then, you know, if you were even in London, the Society venue there. But there's no shortage of places to explore, certainly.
Yes, yes, thinking about the West, there's one place that I would certainly go to, which is called the Inverarnon Arms, which is a most eccentric place, which is very much it's at the north end of Loch Lomond, so it's quite some distance north of Glasgow. And it's an old.
Would you add something from Glasgow?
The Drovers Arms at Inverarnon. It's an old Drovers Inn dating from the 18th century, and that would be worth a visit. Its connection with the Scotch Malt Whisky Society is that John Ferguson, who was one of the founders of the society and a dear friend of mine, Ferguson and I would meet up at the Inverarnon from time to time when we were on our way north. And don't take bus loads there, but a few people go You might be surprised.
5 or 6.
Yes, that's as many as you want to take.
That's good. Well, okay. And if the SMWS takes my idea somehow and runs with it, I need them to remember who came up with this on the air. So I've got this tape. I got this. The numbers are up there. I've got proof in case this ever happens. I want part of it. That's what I'm saying. I do have a question for all of you, though, if this is okay. And I'll read it. It says, the chapter called Some Old Mountaineers introduces the notions of, and we've been talking about this, the descriptions of flavors, mouthfeel, chill filtration, and the use of numbers as opposed to using the distillery. So I've had, personally, and I think Greg as well, many discussions and arguments online pertaining to chill filtration over the last couple of years. And people stating that I could not possibly tell the difference between a whiskey that was chill filtered and not. And I'd like your opinion, Pip, because this comes into what you thought was important. So I'd like to know your opinion so I could quote you in my argument. And possibly what Russell's, your chief chemist from the Chivas group way back when, would have thought about this. As I'm assuming you're going to agree with me that you can taste the difference of chill filtration or feel the difference at least.
It's not simple. I think if you were to take a given cask of whiskey, and to chill filter some of it and not other of its content, and then compare the two on a blind tasting, you might or might not be able to tell the difference. But if you were to do that with 1,000 casks, and you were to examine it statistically, I think you would find that you could then tell the difference, and that the whiskey which had been chill filtered had lost some of its flavor. I think it's at that level.
How about the mouthfeel as opposed to the flavor? So maybe I don't taste the difference, but I could feel the difference. And that's been my argument as well. Can all 4 of you agree that you could taste or feel the difference between chill filtered and non-chill filtered whiskey? Or am I just trying to make myself feel better?
It's difficult. It's difficult to say. I don't know if this has ever been done experimentally. I don't know of anyone who would have a motive for doing it. But certainly Russell Sharp, who was our technical expert right from the beginning and hugely valuable in the whole thing, and who was one of the whiskey industry's leading technicians, Russell was quite clear about it. He said, sure, they chill filter it and it does remove some of the flavor. And this was one of the legs on which the whole enterprise stood.
I would never presume to be able to tell the difference necessarily. I know on the odd occasion when I drink a 40% whiskey, sometimes it will have a much thinner mouthfeel. Not all the time though. So, in a blind setting, I would never presume that I could assume which one was which.
Rob?
I think, as Pip says, there's a science behind chill filtration, and the intent of it is to remove oils so that when the whiskey is chilled, they don't form a cloud in the whiskey. And there's the industry seems to have this thing that would be a problem. So to the extent it's removing, as it's intended to do, oils and other compounds that carry flavor, I have always believed there would be a difference. Now, as Pip says, I've never done the experiment, and I've never talked to anybody who has. So whether you can actually taste it or not, I don't know.
Well, Rob, I think you are, amongst all of us right here, in a unique position where you could have this done.
We could.
Easily. What I would do, if I were you, I'm sorry. What I would do, I would put out 2 bottles. I would have half, and a bottle with chill filtration and one without chill filtration. Sell it out there as a grand experiment and see if people can taste the difference. Have someone pour it blind for you, maybe even to 2 dark glasses, and see if that person can tell. Wouldn't that be a great gimmick, which I would buy?
Yeah, no, I think it would be a really interesting experiment and a really interesting opportunity for consumers to make up their own minds. So yeah, I think that's something that we could certainly do with our little project at some point.
Excellent. I love this. So many things are happening now. The world's revolving. Gregory, what's your thoughts?
Generally speaking, I have always sort of associated the chill filtered with a more watery texture, but I think that might also just be that I have moved on from stuff that's 40% alcohol as a regular to things that are 50 to 60 as a regular. And it might just be that the more alcohol in my mouth gives it a less watery taste.
Okay.
I mean, it's something to think about, but yeah, I generally find there a more mouthfeel on the ones that are cask strength and non-chill filtered. And how much is that due to one? How much is that due to the other? I don't know. I just enjoy the rocket sauce I drink.
It would certainly be possible to set it up and to do a statistical examination. That doesn't present any problems. But whether there was anyone who had the motive to do it and was prepared to spend the time and money to do it, so that's another matter. It would be interesting. But what you have to remember is that if you set up yourself to do it, all you would be discovering might not be anything about whiskey, but something about your personal flavor perception.
Right.
And you would have to, if you were setting it up in a statistically valid manner, you would have to have a range of people whose ability and experience you knew and could ascertain. And that might not be easy. Also, there's also an issue of age. There's no point in asking me to do it, because I'm 81 years old and my nose isn't what it used to be. And I mean, our nose declines with age.
Okay.
And we have to recognize that. Indeed, we had, when I was at the society, we had one old director called Douglas. Mm-hmm. And Douglas he was an ex-headmaster in a Leith school, and he loved lecturing. What he really liked was getting up and telling people about things. And he would describe the flavors of a whiskey, and everyone would be really impressed at his knowledge of the flavors of whiskey. And it was all lifted from the tasting notes. Douglas had no nose to speak of. He's dead now, so I can't claim to. I'm in no danger of being sued. But Douglas passed himself off as an expert on the flavor of whiskey for donkey's years, mostly speaking to folk as old as himself, about something that he knew was there but had no direct perception of. And I thought that was scandalous. I really thought that was not permissible behavior, but it was after I had left, so there wasn't much I could do. But I'm pleased to say that the present management of the society is much more rigorous, and they are very careful about who they engage for tasting whiskies, and they test everyone on their ability to discern flavors.
I'm going to change gears, but we're going to stay on this the tasting notes area. So in chapter 5, the tasting committee and some pigs trotters, we have that, and I've stated this publicly that I would give up my 30-year career as a teacher in a second if I could write these notes. I just want to say that. And at our last tasting, Pip, which was Thursday, actually 2 days ago, and Gregory was there, and so was Kelly and Rob. I said this online that we thought we should have Canadian tasting notes, just because the tasting notes we get in here are a little bit specific to the Scottish palate. Certain names, certain things I've never had or don't recognize because. So I would love to get on a panel to do that. But what I would love more than anything else right now, Pip, is could you tell us your ideas for coming up with this panel in the first place, and link it to the background in wine, please, if you could.
Hold on a second while I pour myself a dram.
As you should. Make it a double, Pip. It's on me.
My original intention had been that if the whiskey was as good as we thought it was, that the expansion of my syndicate would continue, that people would find out about it from other people, and that it would grow naturally. And this indeed happened. And gradually we got more and more members. And we said right from the beginning, there should be no paid for advertising. This was part of the idealistic view of things, that if it was as good as we thought it was, we wouldn't need to advertise. And we didn't. And people came to know about it. But very quickly, we came up with a problem. Once we'd exhausted our first 4 bottles, we had to order some more. And they weren't necessarily the same as the first 4. Indeed, they very obviously weren't the same. And we had the problem was, how do we tell people what we've got in bottle? There are people who have never met us, who are taking it on the recommendation of their friends, and how do we tell them? So we came up with the idea of writing tasting notes about it. I'm not exactly sure whose idea the tasting notes were. Obviously, I think I thought, my recollection is that I thought up the whole thing, but I don't think that's the case at all. I think
it doesn't matter, Pip. You wrote the book, and we're all going to believe the book, so it's you. Done.
There are lots of people putting their oar in. Russell Sharp was particularly influential because he was coming from the background of the whiskey industry, in which they used a thing called the flavor wheel, which you may have read about. It was a completely useless way of describing whiskey flavors, which had been devised by the Pentland Research Institute, it was then called. But it was trying to identify flavors. And the idea arose that we should write tasting notes about whiskies, just as people wrote tasting notes about wines. And it was perfectly clear that we could do, that there were identifiable flavors that we could describe. And so we just set out and did. And I thought, right, now we're going to need a few people to do this cooperatively. You can't just do it with 1 or 2 people. So I thought, what sort of people do we want for this tasting committee? And I thought, well, they've got to be, there are 2 criteria. First of all, they've got to be people who already know and like whiskey, and they've got to be people who know and like language. And the tasting committee stood on these 2 legs of knowledge of whiskey and knowledge of language. So naturally, I looked around my friends and assembled the first tasting committee. We don't, alas, have a portrait of it. There is in existence, I think, a photo of an early tasting committee, But the first one met in the kitchen of my house in Scotland Street in Edinburgh. And I chose for it people who seemed likely. There was Russell Sharp, who was our technical expert, who understood the description of flavor, etc., and who would keep us right. And then there was me, obviously. Then there was an extraordinary friend of mine called Hamish Henderson. Now, Hamish comes into the book, and Hamish was a very difficult man to describe in a few words. He was a scholar and a poet, some distinction. He was a historian. He had been a soldier. He was, and he liked whiskey and drank a lot of it. And he was a totally extraordinary character.
Nice.
And he had set up an organization called the School of Scottish Studies at Edinburgh University, which is still there. And he was a singer. He wasn't a very good singer, but he was a very enthusiastic singer.
He was confident.
And
That's fantastic.
was part of the whole folk song, the movement of folk song, which flourished in the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, and which now, alas, has practically disappeared. But Hamish saw as one of his aims in life was to recover a great deal of Scottish song. Now, the Scots were notorious for they sang songs and they wrote songs. And Robert Burns thought one of his greatest life's work was not so much the writing of songs, but of the recovering of the great body of Scottish folk song. And it was a great enterprise. And Hamish was an obvious must for it. Another one was Willie Gillis. Willie was a Gaelic speaker, and I wanted someone from the Celtic fringe. And not only was Willie a Gaelic speaker, but he was the professor of Celtic at Edinburgh University and a very distinguished academic. And he was also a very nice guy. And then there was my friend Ian Duffield. And Ian was one of my oldest friends. He was a member of the original syndicate, and he's dead now, alas. He came from Birmingham. That's
Are
him.
they on this picture?
That's him on the right with his nose in a glass, on my left hand.
Nice.
And Ian was an extraordinary guy. I have on my wall a painted cartoon in 44 frames of the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba,
Yes.
as it was told in the Kebra Nagast, which was the Ethiopian Bible. And Ian gave me that cartoon. It's a thing, but about 4 feet wide by 2 feet deep. It's a lovely thing. And Ian brought it from Ethiopia must have been the early 1960s. And I'm trying to remember who else there was. I think that was about it.
I'll put the picture back up in case that helps.
There on the left is Tony Trun, who came in later. Yes, this is 1992, so it's quite a long time after the beginning. I don't know who the person next to Tony was. The one on my right is Jim Swan, who was a great expert. And the one on Ian's left is Tim Stewart, who was a pal of ours.
Okay.
And who eventually took the Whisky Society to Japan and now lives in France. I saw him just a couple of weeks ago.
Nice.
But that was the original tasting committee. And it could not have been said to be a great success. I explained to them that what I wanted them to take the whiskies one by one, and I wanted them to smell the whiskey, to describe what it smelt like. And only once they had smelt it, had nosed it, were they to drink it and describe the flavor. And they all drank the whiskey. They all sniffed it once or twice and proceeded to drink it. And I had to explain that they were to take it easy. There were quite a lot of whiskey to try it, and that we were to get through it, hopefully be sober by the end of it.
And this is a working meeting, gentlemen. It's a working meeting.
Working meeting, absolutely. I'm sitting there with a pad and a pen and a pencil, taking notes. And Hamish, I had the highest hopes of. And Hamish stuck his nose in the glass of whiskey. And I said, and how would you describe this whiskey, Hamish? And Hamish said, oh, he said, in his very Highland voice, he said, oh, he said, it's a lovely whiskey. Just a lovely whiskey. I think I described it. And I say, yes, and what else would you say about it? Oh, he said, there's not much you can say. It's a beautiful whiskey. You could not ask for a nicer whiskey than this.
What a political answer.
I said, how about its flavour? And I had already drunk half of it by this time. And he said, yes, he said, it tastes just as good as it smells. And that was all I could get out of him all evening. Willie, I thought, would do better. The Celtic scholar.
Yep.
And Willie giggled. Now, the eminent professor of Celtic at Edinburgh University should have done more in the circumstances than giggle. But all we could get out of Willie all evening was giggles of delight as he tried every whiskey. And so
he was just so happy to be there, Pip.
Russell was good and Ian was good.
Okay.
But the rest were a washout. And I ended up having to write all the tasting notes myself with what little I had been able to put down on the paper. That was the story of the first tasting committee.
And did they get better over time where they could help out more as opposed to just drinking all the whiskey, Pip?
Well, it got a bit better, and we left some of them off and brought other people on, and gradually the thing got a bit more orderly. But it was always difficult. And it came to be regarded as a considerable privilege to be asked, but it didn't stop them just drinking the stuff.
Well,
Pip, speaking of being the first, something here caught my eye from your book, Appreciating Whiskey. The description of you in the very front, there's a couple of sentences about founding the SMWS and the director of the Malt Masterclass, but it goes on to say he is also the first. Now remember, this is copyright 2000. He is also the first and only holder since 1791 of a private license to distill whiskey, which he does for demonstration purposes using a copper pot still. So how about that?
Well,
good story.
That was all true.
It's in there.
Yes, the story's in the Founder's Tale, I think. It started, an artist and well-known cartoonist called Ralph Steadman came into the Whisky Society one evening, into the members' room. This must have been about 1990 or thereabouts. And Ralph had been writing a book about whiskey called Still Life with Bottle. And it was mostly paintings of distilleries and descriptions of whiskies. And I was told he was there and went across and introduced myself. And we sat and we had a few drams. And then we went and had dinner and had a few more drams. And he wanted to know what the Whisky Society was about. And I told him the whole reasoning behind the thing and how what we were doing was bringing the reality as we saw it to the presentation of the public. And he was very receptive to what I was describing about the business of chill filtration and so on. And he said to me afterwards that he phoned his publisher first thing the next morning and tried to get him to stop the book printing because he wanted to write a chapter about the Whisky Society. Because he said he had, while everyone in the whisky industry had been terribly kind to him, he had had a feeling that there was an inner truth of the matter which he wasn't quite getting to. And that I had been telling him what he could see was the real story. And it became a friendship, and the two of us got on very well. Now, another person who had approved greatly of what we were doing at the Whisky Society was a man called, sorry, my memory is failing me here.
That's okay. It gives us a chance to drink, Pip.
Yeah. Sir Kenneth Alexander. Now, Ken Alexander was a good old boy.
Okay.
And when Harold Wilson's Labour government in 1964 or 65 had decided to do something about the economic condition of the Highlands, they had set up the Highlands and Islands Development Board, which was to put government funding into industry in the Highlands to bring jobs where they were needed. And he had chosen Ken Alexander to be the chairman of the Highland Board and to make things happen. And he couldn't have chosen a better person. And Ken was already well known as a very eminent academic economist. And he was well known to the whisky industry. And during his time at the Highland Board, he was given a whisky still by an old guy who had used it for illicit distilling up in Glenlivet.
Good for him.
And the old boy had given it to him on condition that it never be adulterated. Now, in those days, the customs and excise who were in charge of such things wouldn't allow anyone to own a spirit still. It was complete blanket removal. You could only own it if it had been destroyed as an effective still. They insisted you drill holes in it. This was on the assumption that somebody who had the wit to distill whiskey wouldn't have the wit to solder a few holes. But that's by the by. Now, Ken had given his promise that this still would never be adulterated. And he gave it to me for the society because he approved so strongly of what we were doing. And he saw that what we were doing could only benefit the Scotch whisky industry, which at the time was on its knees. And you must remember, these were bad times for the whisky industry. There was any amount of whisky and they didn't know how to sell it. They had the best distilled liquor on the entire planet and they didn't know what to do with it. It's scarcely credible. Ken gave us the still, and I had shown it to Ralph Steadman. And Ralph rang me up one day and he said, "This still of yours, Pip," he said, "how would you feel about distilling whiskey in England?" And I said, "Well, if I could get a license, fine, but I don't think it's likely." Yeah, and he explained, he said, "I have to open the Cheltenham Arts Festival, which was a big literary and artistic festival in the south of England, happens every year. And Ralph is the celebrity who does the openings, the opening ceremony." He said, "How about bringing your still along and distilling whiskey for the opening ceremony?" And I said, "Well, I'll see if I can get a license. I'm up for it if I can get the license." And so I thought, right, how do I get a license? I phone up Customs and Excise in Dundee, which was their head office then. So I phoned them up And I explained what I was about. And I said, I want to distill whiskey. I'm not going to sell it or drink it, but I want a license so that using this little still will be legal. Can I have one? And the person at the other end of the phone said, no.
No.
And I said, why not? He said, because it's against the law. Have you not heard that there's a law against it? I said, well, I had, but I mean, it's a long time. Which law is it? And he said, it's the Excise Act, the Excise and Duties Act of 1788 prohibits distilling with a small still. So you can't have a license. And he said, where were you going to do this distilling anyway? And I said, in a place called Cheltenham. And he said, where's that? And I said, somewhere in the south of England. Oh, he says, it's nothing to do with us anyway. Obviously glad to get this decision off his back. There's nothing to do with us. It's you'll need to apply to the office in Cardiff. Now, the office in Cardiff is in Wales. It's not in England at all. But he said, I'll give you their telephone number. You can ring them. So I said, thank you very much. So I rang up the office in Cardiff, and I got a very nice Welsh accent on the other. And the Welsh is a lovely accent. And I explained what it was all about. And they said, and where are you going to be distilling this whiskey? And I said, in Cheltenham, which they tell me is in the south of England. And they said, and what are you going to be doing with it? And I said, well, we're only going to let people sniff it. We're not going to let them drink it. We'll pour it all down the drain. Oh, they said, that's fine. That sounds perfectly innocent. You can have a license. So I got a private distiller's license to use a small still. And I am convinced that it was the first such license which had been issued for a whiskey still since the Excise Act of 1788. That's what that story is about.
And you worked hard for it. And I'm going to come back. Was that daring? Was that luck?
It was just chancing your arm. I mean, if you don't ask, you don't get.
So I'm still wondering, is it more daring or is it more luck? It's one of these things, Pip. All these things revolve around you at a certain point. I think it's good to know these things. Are you a very lucky person, or do you just push the envelope just a little bit and just hope it goes your way?
Well, I wasn't always lucky. I mean, as I said in the book, some things ended well and some things ended absolutely disastrously.
Yeah.
I mean, one of them ended up with me splitting my femur.
You
don't
climbing.
I mean, as bad luck goes, splitting your thigh bone lengthwise
It's pretty bad.
It still bothers me at airports.
Ooh.
There was a time when it would always ring the alarm bells when I went through the baggage check, and then the machines got a bit more sensitive, and it didn't. But apparently they got even more sensitive. And the last time I tried it, it rang the bells again. I've got 3 big screw nails in my thigh. So it wasn't always lucky. It was foolishness quite a lot of the time.
Okay. Daring. We're going to call it daring, Pip.
Daring is a phrase which I would steer clear of. I mean,
I'd go with it. But I just want to say we didn't finish the story about where that still is anymore. And you have to buy the book to find out where that still is right now. And it says in the book. So don't tell them. Read the book. That's it. Okay.
Thank you. He's not getting paid for this,
Nope. No, but we support the books. We're here. We're the Whisky Book Clubs, and we will promote the whiskey books because it's what we're about. It's what we love.
The book, the thing had given rise to so many stories. And after I'd left the society, I could see that the stories were growing. and in many cases changing. And I thought really it was time that I wrote the, if you like, the only true version, and put it, everyone has their own take on things, but that's it as I saw it. And I thought it wasn't a bad format to have the overall format of starting the Whisky Society and put into it some of the stories that went up to make it up.
Pip, may I ask a question? I mean, one of the things that I think members enjoy about the society, and one of the things that drew Kelly and I to the society, is the camaraderie with members. And you know, you may cover this in later chapters of the book that we'll get to in subsequent weeks. But I guess, was that always part of the plan, or was that in part just your personality and your enjoyment of friendship and sharing drams and those types of experiences, and that just became part of what the society is?
I would say that it was always part of the plan that we would have the sort of fun we had with the original syndicate, only we would spread it more widely. I wouldn't say that was the intention of everyone who joined or who became part of the firm. There's no doubt that there were some people who were attracted to this because they saw themselves as connoisseurs of whiskey who were in some respects superior to folk who weren't connoisseurs of whiskey. You know, the Americans have a delicate term for it. They call them assholes.
Well, if the title fits, Pip, it's okay.
Yeah. I always had a problem with people like that. There were the thing, you could see that the thing was set up. It was a society that anyone could join, but you had to find out about it in order to join it. That what we had was the best distilled liquor on the entire planet. And that's not an exaggeration. We were taking the finest product of the Scotch whisky industry in its perfect condition, and we were making it available to our members. It was a lovely marketing line. Can you imagine any marketing man having this as a description of the product? But it was true, and it was terribly attractive. But you can see that there were always going to be people who would want to squirrel this sort of stuff away and use it as a way to advancing their social ambitions.
Okay.
And so we always attracted a certain element of that kind. And I must say, after I fought tooth and nail against people like that. And I was worried at one time that that's what the society would turn into, a society of connoisseurs who would bottle this whiskey, who would sell it for enormous prices, which would exclude all normal people and would become a connoisseurs club. And that, I thought, was no fun at all for anyone. And I did my best to keep it out of the hands of these people. After I left the society, I saw it as an increased danger because the people I'd been fighting against saw me out of the way and they thought they would have a free run. I'm pleased to say that the ethos of the thing survived and into the present day. And one of the things, when David Ridley approached me 2 or 3 years ago and said, how would I feel about coming back into the fold? I was very cagey and said, you know, I would certainly come and talk to you, and okay, if I like what I see. And I must say, I liked what I saw hugely. they had, after Glenmorangie had sold the company, these guys could see that what was valuable in it was this ethos which we had created in the first instance. And they, I think, are perfectly sincere in realizing that this is how it ought to be, and which is why I'm very happy with them, and why minor issues, say, to do with the labeling or the bottle or what have you, those are all minor. What is important is the spirit of camaraderie, that everyone coming into the society, everyone's coming in on a basis of equality and comradeship. And it doesn't matter whether you have the best nose in the world or not, you're going to get something out of it. And you're going to contribute to it by having a good time among like-minded people.
And I think you needed to...
It sounds idealistic, but it seems to be working.
No, we like idealistic, but this was from the very beginning. When you started, or you came up with the idea of getting the two casks, the second cask from Glenfarclas, there was people who opposed it at that point as well, correct, Pip? People who didn't want it. So going back to the second time you went back to Glenfarclas, where you're buying two barrels, there were people that opposed it then, that didn't want to open up.
Yes, there were one or two people who opposed that. And once we decided to make the thing into a limited company, there were people who objected strongly, and those were very few of them. But those were people who saw it as something private and exclusive, which they had. I've always detested the word exclusive as a way of praising something. The idea that something would be good simply because somebody else couldn't get it seemed to me a despicable way of living your life. And
so you
always
opposed the idea of this being a gentleman's club in the traditional sense that they would have in London, correct? You opposed that completely. There were people that wanted that, obviously, but you opposed it.
Yes. Oh, there were people who saw the members' room at the Vaults as the ideal of a gentleman's club. I don't know if you guys have been there, but it's a very pleasant room, and it's not much different from what it was when first we furnished it. And I would say I had to fight tooth and nail to get that made a members' bar against my fellow board members who saw that there was no future for such a thing. And I said, nonsense, it's a wonderful room. It's a great place to meet your friends and drink whiskey in. And sorry, on that
Kelly
one.
and Rob, I'm guessing you've been there a couple times. We've got Nick Pollard on the side who's been there, and everyone that talks about it makes me terribly jealous. Gregory, have you been?
Not yet, no.
Well, we're going to go. We have to. And I like how they introduced Nick when Nick came in.
The building is the oldest commercial building in Scotland, which is still in use for something like its original purpose. It was the vaults underneath it. And if you go there, ask them if you can see one of the vaults. It's dark and it's musty, and it enters on the left there. There's a stair goes down there. And
down.
The fungus hangs on the ceiling, which was brought by wine casks from Bordeaux. And
from this company here, right here.
It was owned by the monks of Newcastle Abbey, which is about 10 miles away, and they bought whiskey by the shipload from Bordeaux, and they exchanged it for coal, which their slaves dug in Midlothian. And there is, just down the road from the vaults, there is a quayside, on the river, which is called the Coal Hill. And anything less like a coal hill than a quayside, it's hard to imagine. But in fact, for 500 years, there was a pile of coal on that quayside, and the ships brought their wine from Bordeaux to the vaults and took the coal back as their cargo. And it was then owned by the Vintners Guild of the Port of Leith, a medieval craft guild. And in one of the ground floor apartments in the vault, there is an alcove with a plaster scallop shell above it, where the Dean of Guild auctioned the cargoes of wine among his members. I mean, it's the real thing. And the building passed out of ownership of the Vintners Guild sometime towards the end of the 18th century. In 1722, it was bought by John Thompson, and in 1785, his grandsons raised it to a 4-story building. They used pine in the structure of it. It's built of pine and whinstone. You can see, can you see this picture I'm looking at? You can see that the first story, the stone is a darker color than the rest of it.
Yes.
And that was the point at which I think they built the stair, and they then made a 4-story building. And they did that in 1785, and it has been in use in the liquor trade
Ever
since certainly 1722, possibly since the 1530s. It's the genuine article, and it was dilapidated until 1983. And one day I had the idea that we would need somewhere as our headquarters for this new Whisky Society. And I walked up the stair to their first floor office and asked to see who was in charge. And a very nice man called John Walters came out wearing a pinstripe suit with a watch chain across his belly and said, who was I and what could he do for me? And I explained who I was and that I was looking for a building, and that this one looked as though it would do me very nicely. And was there any chance of buying it? And he said, well, as a matter of fact, the firm is moving to new premises next month. And if you made them a reasonable offer, I'm sure they would accept it. So I went back to my syndicate, and among us, we raised £50,000. And I went back to J.G. Thompson and Company and offered them £50,000, and they said, done. And I think I put in the book, I could feel the hairs rising on the back of my neck.
Yeah.
And it was as simple as that. The building turned out to be a disaster, of course.
Well, and I have some questions about that, Pip.
But
because
we got the building, and it is a great building.
Mm-hmm.
Dolph, that circles back to your themes about luck and timing, being at the right place at the right time.
Isn't it? I think it is. But I wanted to ask Kelly if it was luck, because there's more to the story later that he doesn't get into in the book about how it was in a bit of disrepair. And I didn't know to the extent that it was, because I was thinking it was luck, just like you said, £50,000 for it. But it's a 300-year-old building, which seems like an idealistic part of his. And your choice of that very specific time to go up and ask that gentleman, it all seemed very copacetic. It all comes together. So, but could you tell us, Pip, about it? It was luck, but let's say it wasn't luck afterwards, because you did have to spend quite a bit of money. Can you explain what the problems were?
It was disastrous. I won't go into that period. It was very painful. There was a lot of painful stuff associated with that. We managed to hold it together, and the building company had to be put into liquidation. And fortunately, by that time, the Whisky Society itself, because we kept the two companies separate, was doing well enough to buy the first floor back from it. I'd rather not go into that. But we came out of it. And It's very difficult to say what's luck and what's not. I've always been a very skeptical sort of person, and but when I was in my 20s, I spent 7 years studying philosophy, and the last 2 or 3 of these years I studied the philosophy of a man called Georg Hegel, who was a German idealist in the later 18th century. Probably none of you have heard of him. Most people haven't.
Sorry.
But he was immensely influential, and he thought that he had a philosophy of history, and he thought that the world, everything, he was an idealist. Now, this is a philosophical idealist, which is different from what we commonly think of as an idealist. He thought that the only reality was mental.
Okay. Your own perception.
That what we think of as material reality, the glasses which we're holding, the spirit which is in them, is a sort of illusion, that the only real reality is mental, and that the whole of the universe is part of a universal mind which is developing itself by means of material things. Now, I know this probably sounds pretty crazy to you, but it was enormously influential. Karl Marx read Hegel, and he was immensely impressed. He was immensely impressed by his theory of history developing according to the principles of this mental reality, and he stood it on its head. And from idealistic dialectic, Marx described dialectical materialism. And if you don't think, as I said in the book, if you don't think that's influential, you should get out more, because that's what brought about communism and a large part of the way the modern world is. I'm pleased to say it seems to have run its course now, but it influenced the whole of much of the 19th and much of the 20th century. But just occasionally in my life, I have had the feeling that maybe what I'm doing is part of that process. And that was one of the times. Not very often, but just occasionally.
At that point.
Okay. Sorry, this probably sounds completely daft to you, but I suspect it is completely daft. But
I don't think so.
That's the way I was thinking at the time.
I think I'm going to go to the base thought of luck, just for a little while, just because it's fun and playful there, Pip.
Luck's something different.
Okay. We're at the end of 2 hours together, everybody. Time flies, but I do want to ask last question. So Kelly and Rob individually, if you have any last comments or questions, Gregory, and we'll finish with Pip.
No, it's been lovely. I'm looking forward to next week. Yeah.
Yeah.
Me too.
Appreciate it's 9 p.m. for Pip. So
Yes.
Thank you.
And how about you, Greg?
I don't have any questions per se. I enjoyed all of it. I'm looking forward to next week. I imagine between now and then my brain will fill with many intelligent questions, and then next week they'll drop out as soon as we start. Completely forgetting everything, but that's just the way it is. Looking forward to next time.
Thank you, sir. Pip, last comments? And before the last comments, thank you very much for coming on today. It's been a blast. I've really enjoyed our time together.
Well, it's been very nice speaking to you, I must say.
Oh, good.
It's also quite nice to get a lot of this stuff off my chest now and then.
I'm here for that. If there's anything else really touchy you want to get off your chest, you go right ahead, Pip.
Okay.
I'm a welcome individual. Well,
Yeah, Dolph also needs lots of blackmail to get on the committee.
I need to get on that committee. I need to start writing. And one little thing, my wife sent me a note, as your wife is sending you notes, Pip. Mine was just to make sure you understand that when I say daring, it might have a different connotation for you. For us, daring it's a very positive sentiment. It's to be daring is to put oneself out there, to be able to possibly work with the positive and negative, to succeed and not succeed, and you do put yourself out there. And that's what that was, going upstairs to the vaults and asking if you could actually buy the building. Who does that?
My wife Maggie pointed out to me earlier that possibly I was using daring in a different sort of sense, because I was referring to my early life when I was a mountaineer.
That is daring.
We would occasionally use the term daring to refer to a move. And the point about that is that unlike any other sport, you would make a move and you would have to be daring to make the move, because you knew that if it didn't succeed, you died.
Yes. And yes, that is more daring than my definition of it. But I'm not a mountaineer, so I'm a teacher. There's not so much daring in my line of work. Well, a little bit. It's junior high students. That's it. Well, that's it. Thank you very much. That's all the time we have tonight, Whiskey Friends.
Look forward to next week.
Thank you. It's been fantastic evening.
All right.
We're going to thank our listeners. We're going to thank our panel. Thank you. Oh, this direction. Thank you all very much. So Nick, Gregory, Nick on the side, Kelly, Rob, Pip, absolute pleasure spending this time with you. And I hope you had as much fun as I did. So join us next week. It's my wrap up, Saturday, November 13th for part 2. And you know what? Thanks to Maggie in the background too, getting you all set up there today. Thank you, Maggie. Next week, part 2 of the Whisky Book Club's 13th book. Here's the book again. Buy it right there. Nice Christmas present. The Founder's Tale, A Good Idea, and a Glass of Malt with author Pip Hills. We'll be doing the show from the Keg and Cork next week, one of the Canadian shops that's allowed to sell SMWS products. So it's also the location of our Alberta Scotch Society's very first in-person tasting in a year and a half. We're going to do that right after our show. So it's going to be really fun for the show, and then really fun after the show. And as a final note, if you don't want to miss a minute of future episodes, click like and subscribe. So grab a glass, everybody. We're holding up. Here's to good company. Here's to good whiskey. Here's to good books. And here's to good conversation. Sláinte. Cheers, everybody. I'll see you next week.